If this is your first time checking me out, you can go to hy.page/vradio. There you can find me on all of my various mediums, including Rumble, BitChute, etc. You could join us on Discord, Telegram, Facebook. All of that can be found at hy.page/vradio. Today, my guest is Jonathan Turner. Jonathan Turner is a sociologist who was sounding the alarm quite a long time ago about how sociology as a science was being co-opted by activism. I took a serious interest in sociology even when I was younger. In fact, I remember one day when I was in middle school, I think the counselor thought I was depressed or something because I was sitting around and at the lunch. So he asked to talk to me and he asked me what was bothering me. And I gave him this big in-depth analysis of the sociological breakdown of the school system. And he was like, "Where did you study sociology?" I was like, "What's sociology?" Because I wasn't even aware at that time that there was a science about studying how groups interact. Since then, it's always been something that was important to me, although I never studied it formally. It's really important to understanding group dynamics because things become different when groups of people interact. And I discuss that quite a bit on my show in my Do You Think for Yourself series. So today, welcome. What should I call you, Dr. Turner?
No, John.
John, it is. All right,
Yeah.
John. So I always ask my new guests, what was the precipice moment for you? What was the moment that made you go, okay, I can't just be a bystander anymore. I really need to kind of dive into this and try to do something about it. And I guess that's kind of what led to this paper that I'm showing here. That is how I discovered you. Was there a specific moment where you went, okay, I've had it. I really need to come out about this topic of sociology being co-opted?
Well, it wasn't a moment. It was a long, slow burn for a while, and then it was also clearing the decks of my own uh, previous self as a young man, as an activist in the civil rights movement in the South, uh, having found myself in jail a few times for it. I was raised to be very liberal, and I've always felt very strongly about the very things that people feel strongly about today, especially civil rights. And when I was a young man, I was willing to risk my life to help people. And so I was always the activist part. I don't have any problem with. It's the activist as an intellectual and a scientist. That's where the conflict always is. It's one thing to be an activist, and that's what most sociologists want to be today. Uh, and it's a shame because what's happened is that they're no longer doing intellectual work. That's always the big rub. If you're going to do science, you have to be, when you're doing your science, as value neutral as you can be. And it's obviously impossible to be completely value free, but you've got to make a real effort. And we try to be very aware of your biases. Uh, and if you're going to be an activist, well, you don't need a PhD to be an activist. You don't need a degree. You don't need to be teaching in a college. If you want to be an activist, be an activist. I was one, and I know it's a dangerous place. That's what I used to tell students in the late 60s and early 70s is if you ever leave the campus here, be careful. People out there who want to get you, they've got guns. And a week later, when I gave that talk and speech teaching day at UCR, 1,000 people were there. The massacre at Kent State occurred, and it was just a good example of, remember, people with power have guns, and people who want power tend to try to use guns, especially in the United States. So when I began as a sociologist, I just like any other newly minted academic, I really didn't have any idea where I was going to go, what I was going to do. I wasn't even clear whether I wanted to be a researcher or just a teacher. Um, and at that point in time, and I was 26 years old when I got my PhD, and I was still a very young man and still very much involved in civil rights kinds of things, my personal life. And I didn't see any conflict between that and my sociology. It seemed like sociology would help me be aware of the kinds of issues that I need to be aware of. And I just went about teaching my classes and whatnot. And one of the things I immediately learned is that it's very easy to start letting your political biases come into your lectures. And students are interested in that. But I wasn't sure that was quite right. I should be trying to give them the best sort of neutral knowledge I can about how this thing works and that works and this works, and then let them decide for themselves whether this is good or bad or it needs to be changed. But I didn't have any real strong feelings about it. I got my PhD in 1968, and that's the sort of height of the 60s, before the sort of violent part of it began. And, I still didn't see the big problem. These issues were being debated all the time around the tables in the student unions, but it seemed to me the sociologists were doing generally pretty good at being value neutral and just doing sociology. But I soon learned in my career within the first decade that I had to make an adjustment. And the adjustment became this. Students were always asking me in my early days, what were my politics? And I initially would tell them my politics, and then I realized that's a mistake. I don't want them to know my politics. So I was teaching value neutral enough because it wasn't clear to them what my politics were. I was teaching courses that were very amenable to student inquiry: sociology 1, social problems, ethnic relations. I taught all the big lecture classes at UC Riverside because that's worked best for me, because I had 8 TAs to do all the work. All I had to do is stand up there and be articulate and maybe a little funny 2 times a week. And that was a good deal, and let the TAs do all the work. But the fact that they asked said that they don't know, but they want to find out. And I just realized this is the 60s, this is now the 70s, maybe now, 60s, late 60s to the 70s. They find out, and I realized I don't think I want them to know my politics, not because I'm embarrassed by them, but because I think it gets in the way of my communicating with them. And I realized in my lectures there were a lot of very intelligent students asking sort of what I would consider right-wing questions, or questions that a conservative Republican in those days might ask. They were intelligent questions, and I would try my best to answer them. And I could see if I were spewing my ideology, that student wouldn't even listen to me. And so I made that decision somewhere in the mid to late 70s to get rid of any kind of value sets or pushing of values or ideologies in my classes. I wanted to be value neutral, let students just get the facts as they needed them, and make up their own decisions about what their politics are going to be. And I think sociology will guide you the right way if you just have that knowledge. And I don't know if you can see these are some of my books on the back wall. It's actually 49 of my books. And these ones way down at the right side, when I'm looking at the picture of me, if you look at the titles of those books, I can't remember them all. We got to turn around and read them. So one is American Society, Problems of Structure, American Dilemma, Enduring Dilemmas in American Society, Inequality, Privilege, and Poverty in America, and books like that. So they really did have an ideological tinge to them. And I said, I can't write books. I'm not going to write books like that anymore. I'm going to try to write more value neutral books. And so even when I redid some of my social problems books because the publisher wanted it, I switched and made it very value neutral as much as I could. And just tried to give them the facts of the issues that were being presented in a given chapter. And that began that was my transformation. It wasn't a big moment. It was sort of a several-year transition. It initially came to me in my teaching that I couldn't write books with those titles and be considered value neutral. And I couldn't use those books in my classes because they weren't value neutral. So later on, when I wrote a book, much later on in my career, I wrote a book called American Ethnicity, The Consequences of Discrimination. It was a very value neutral book driven by a theory, by a general theory of ethnic intentions and relations. And it was a much better book, and it actually sold quite well. It went through 8 editions, and it just stopped because I don't want to do it anymore. I got other things to do with the last years of my life and rewrite textbooks.
So I think that
So,
just to, I guess, to kind of bring back to focus as to far as everything that you just said is absolutely relevant to what the problem is that you're pointing out that we're allowed to have our own personal opinions about things, but the opinions are not relevant to the science. And I think that that's where the problems lie, is that um people are allowing their personal bias to become part of it, and maybe it's easier to get away with that. Pardon me. If you're just writing opinion pieces, but it's a problem when your opinion becomes part of your scientific process, because at that point you've ceased to be science. You wanted to go ahead and comment on that?
right, yeah, that's right, and that period of time, my first part of my career, I was transitioning from studying societies in a broader sense, and interested in social problems and social movements of the time. But then I realized you can't be a member of the social movement and have that be your sociology. That's your personal life, that's your politics. And in fact, the students would say, and they asked me my politics, and I said, I won't tell you. And I said, do you see a bias in me? He says, no, we don't know what you are. I said, that's good. That's exactly my point. I
And that
don't want
was
you to.
right, and that used to just be kind of understood, that that's how you do it, because we're supposed to be molding young minds to be, kids that can make their own decisions about things. That
Yeah,
we're supposed to just be teaching them how to become informed. And instead, we're turning our ideology into the education itself. We're telling kids essentially almost like that there's a wrong think. Like, I actually got my hands on it was a video that was leaked of a kind of a teach-in thing where they're teaching professors how to push the woke stuff into their curriculums, and in such a way also to teach them how to silence students who didn't agree. Like, and if they asked questions that are inappropriate, what strategies that they should use to pressure these students to not even, ever dare to contradict what was being said. And that's supposed to be like the opposite of what college is about.
that is the opposite of what college should be about. And that's what bothered me. And I had a number of colleagues, and I had some of those colleagues for 40 years. I fought them the whole way and on this issue. But it became more and more of an issue within the department in terms of recruiting new faculty and things like that. And over the course of my career, and it became, to me, a minor nuisance problem that I could handle by just changing my behavior. But it became a problem in a sort of departmental politics. What's their next faculty hire? What's going to be their field? What's going to be their orientation? So the department was constantly split. It was always, the scientists would always win, but sort of barely, it would always be a big fight and a lot of bruised feelings. And that got to be very tiring over the years. And I hung in there for a long time on it. And finally, I just said, at 73 years old, I never planned to retire, because I still work today, every day, 4 or 5 to 8 hours every day, because I enjoy it. And I write a book this year and much of articles a year, and I've been doing everything I always did. But I'm retired. I kind of wish I'd known how nice retirement is, because it was all that crap in the department that I don't have to deal with anymore. And I was very happy in it. And eventually my department's in receivership now. It's not even allowed to allow graduate students. The polarization between the science and non-science people got so bad that the department's sort of been put in receivership.
And
And I don't know if it'll ever
something
come out.
something that you said, like, before we got on the air, was you pointed out that we had discovered so much important information, critical information for understanding how humans interact with one another, that sociology had hit like its peak. of its relevance and how powerful it would be to help society. And then this starts, and now you have concerns that sociology as a science itself is just going to kind of crumble. I mean, that, do you want to expand upon that a little bit? I mean, like, where were we at when we were at that golden peak, and then how does it
Well,
compare to where we are now?
the golden peak in sociology has been the last 50 years. As a general theorist and a person who's always writing about a lot of different things, I refer from the biology and the neurology of human behavior to the dynamics of the world system and everything in between I've written about, because that's what I'm interested in. I'm not a specialist. I'm just the exact opposite of the specialist. That puts me on a career path that's very different than most people's career path, because most people specialize, stay in a narrow area, and just do their work. I get bored doing that, so I'm always moving around to talk about different areas. But the problem now is we are now we had this golden age, and we're basically throwing it away because the new students are not reading anything except things they want to read. And sadly, graduate students are studying themselves these days. Now, we had these big social movements occurring during the 60s, the civil rights, which have been going for a long time, but it peaked in the 1960s, and you had the Civil Rights Acts. Then, of course, came feminism, and then various you can have the liberal initials you have in the list of initials keeps growing, but everything about sexuality is a hot topic,
Right.
and so these students, those people who were interested in those things, like a lot of sociology majors, as I was back in the 60s, uh, interesting to them. They're interested, if you're a woman, you certainly be interested in the fact that you're being discriminated against in only subtle and obvious ways. And so you can see how that happened. If you're African American discriminated against, certainly you're going to be interested in that because it affects everything about your life, and so on and so forth. But so you had these social movements going through the society during the 60s and 70s. All those young people recruited to those movements, and I was one of the ones who was recruited to the civil rights movement. I wasn't involved in the others, but some portion of them became sociologists, and so they they basically want to study themselves. If you're gay or lesbian, you want to study that. If you're black, you want to study black studies. If you're Latino, you want to do that. If you want, and if you're whatever it is that you're interested in the political movement, that's what you study, and that's you. So you study yourself, and when you're lecturing, you're talking about yourself and your priorities in life and what's important to you. But you're no longer talking about sociology as a broader field. It's a huge field. It studies everything from interpersonal behavior and the biology of that, all the way to the world system. If we had contact with other planets, it would be intergalactic systems we'd study. We study everything in between them. No social science does that. They're all over specialized compared to what sociology has been. And what's happening now to sociology is that people are retreating to the narrow specialties just to get away from the sort of movement that you can't get away from in the sociology department anymore. But they're trying just by hiding in their narrow specialty, and just to avoid the kinds of conflicts that go on all day to day. Every day there's conflict in the sociology department. And every day the students become more and more oriented to sort of sometimes derisively I call them politically correct issues, but they're not. They shouldn't be saying that. I shouldn't say that because they are issues that are very important. People's civil rights are pretty darn important. That's certainly one of the highest priorities I have in my life, to make sure that I further that in some way. But that's the concern in itself. They
That
have
was
no interest.
actually.
No
Go ahead
interest
and
in
finish
any.
what you were going to say there.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I was saying, go ahead and finish what you were going to say, and then I'm going to say something.
So I would like to see a black sociological theorist. There have been a few who one or two quite good. But that's not what African Americans are interested in. They're interested in themselves, and I understand that they've been viciously discriminated against for all these years. Women certainly, my God, they've been discriminated against, and that's all. And if that is your passion, your goal in life is to somehow make that better, there's plenty of social movements you can join on that a lot soon. If your goal in life is to communicate knowledge that discipline has accumulated over a 200-year period, and especially over the last 50 years, uh, you've got to put those other issues aside and just talk about the sociology of any issue like ethnic relations. That's fine. Of sexuality, that's fine. But there's a zillion other things going on in the world. The world is not just made up of ethnicity and sexuality and gender issues. It's made up of institutional systems and stratification systems and all kinds of other processes that sociologists study. And those are just being ignored. You go to an ASA meeting these days, half the sessions are on social justice issues. And the research is very mediocre because we know this. Sociology has studied this for 100 years intensely, and we know the dynamics of this process. There's not much more new we can learn about it. You can describe it historically and describe particular cases and stuff, and that's what people are doing. And so these sessions full of ethnic and gender issues and sexuality issues uh, dominate the program now. It's not that these are unimportant issues, but they shouldn't be the dominant focus of the discipline. But I'm afraid that's the case, and
Right.
I'm also convinced it's not stoppable. It's when I wrote a book with Steve Turner, no relation, many years ago. I think it was published in the late '80s, early '90s, and it's called The Impossible Science. And the subtitle says what it was: an institutional history of sociology, especially in the United States. Uh, the I begin, my co-author believed sociology couldn't be a science, and he and I are writing a book together is kind of remarkable because here I am, the biggest advocate for hard science sociology, and probably the biggest critic of hard science sociology, are both named Turner, and we wrote a book together.
Right.
It didn't sell very many much, but it cited a lot. It's kind of remarkable how a book had only sold about 1,000 copies. It gets cited all the time, but I don't know if there are people reading it or it's PDF'd all over the world. I don't
It's
know. It's kind
probably
of
PDF'd at this point. I wanted to comment a little bit on what you were saying earlier because it kind of it lines up with a lot of different phases of my own activism. And then it's interesting, like, you pointed out, like, you were, a civil rights advocate, and so you came at this from that direction and you recognize that all those things are important. And I mean, it would sound then that, you're kind of a left-leaning person. I'm a left-leaning person, but it's like one of the things I noticed. So for example, when Occupy Wall Street happened, it was originally like the whole idea was like we were the unified 99% against the 1% that was supposed to be like, the super, super wealthy. And the environment there at that time had a feeling that was similar to the civil rights movement in a lot of ways. We were strictly nonviolent. But everybody, it was all colorblind, gender neutral. We were all unified under one banner, like one tribe. And then the social justice stuff shows up, and then all of a sudden that's everything, and it has this division effect where all of a sudden now we're bickering over, well, have enough people of the right color spoken at this meeting? Is this person the wrong color or the wrong gender, or are they privileged? Or and the thing is it's like a sociological bomb that went off in Occupy and then divided it and turned it into bickering factions that are all fighting over which one of them is more important. And then, worse than that, it became about, well, where you fit on the oppression scale determines your place in the new hierarchy. Like, instead of just trying to make us all equal, it became about, well, if I'm black and trans and gay, then my point is more valid than yours just by virtue of where I place in the oppression scale. And if you're not as oppressed as I am, then you should just shut up and listen. And that was one of the reasons why it started to get out of control, because at that point, whether or not the person who fit higher on the oppression scale than you was rational or even making a valid point was secondary to you. If you happen to be, for example, the worst of the worst, which is the straight white cis male, then you should just sit there quietly and just not say anything, because you're not allowed to do that. And the thing is that, just like you, I agree all of those things are important. I considered myself, supportive of feminist ideology at that time. I definitely considered myself supportive of any kind of, um, civil rights activism so far as race, but it ends up just turning everybody against each other. And I think that was one of the things, I don't know if you ever watched it. I shared a video that I had done that was reporting on why this specific approach to doing things actually creates kind of like a tribalism effect. Like, one of the doctors in the paper that I cited said that it's like there's a button in your forehead, and if you push it, then you're going to immediately become defensive, and and it actually creates more bigotry, it creates more racism, it creates more negative interaction, because at that point you start to feel like you're defending your group, and instead of just being all part of the same group. And that was what, to me, I watched it just destroy Occupy. And that because I was at multiple camps, it was like I had a control and an experiment, because at the Flint camp, for whatever reason, this never happened. So Flint was way more productive, way less strife, much better cooperation. We had better living conditions. We had solar power. We had, and it was because we weren't spending all this time bickering about which one of us was more oppressed. It was about, well, we're unified towards this one goal. Occupy was really about fighting classism. And the idea was is that if we raise everybody's lifestyle up, everybody does better. And yeah, and yes, that doesn't mean that racism is not important or sexism is not important, but if you look at it as a grand whole, you start to understand that a lot of those issues are just kind of symptoms of the greater problem of just the massive wealth inequality that can exist in our society. But all of that was kind of thrown in the trash because these individual activist things needed to become more important. And you would watch them turn on each other like a bunch of witch hunters at an inquisition trying to determine which one of them was more pure. Now, I've said a lot there, so I wanted you to give you an opportunity to comment on what I'm
Well,
saying. Does that make sense to
well,
you?
I agree though. I remember one of my colleagues saying, if you're not on the vanguard of fighting oppression, you're part of the problem. That was typical kind of line. Um, and I said, if you're doing that in your classroom, you're really a big problem, because you're not teaching the students what they need to do. You're catering to their biases, and you're also totally distorting your reading list to focus on activism. You're probably not doing very much structural analysis and cultural analysis of how things came about. And you need to do that if you're going to be a sociologist. The whole point of sociology is to let students know to the extent to which the social structure and culture of a society in all its various ways uh, affects their lives. And so if you study inequality, if you have a course in inequality, the idea is to show how does inequality affect people's lives, and how does the culture legitimating inequality work against, for, or against certain categories of persons. And to me, when you just do the sociology, it contains the critique in it itself without ever having to be critiqued, because it immediately becomes clear that something like the unequal distribution of resources at the level of, say, the United States does this is really quite unfair. It involves a considerable amount of discrimination, and it's very important. Sociology is very important in outlining the ways in which not having any money works against you. You can't get it. If you don't have any money when you're growing up, it's hard to get. because you have to be exceptionally lucky or exceptionally talented to be able to earn a lot of money, to get the education or those kinds of skills you need to earn a lot of money. So athletes can do it, and people who are talented in singing and things like that can do it. But the average person can't do it so easily because the world's working against them.
Right.
And so that's the important message sociology has to say. And in fact, one of the little lectures that I did in social work for many years is I drew a line across the board, and I said this is the line between being non-working middle class, and the further down you go, the less the more poor you are, and above it's the more affluent you are. And let's have two kids born at the one end here, and let's go through their lives now. And so I would spend an hour talking about both kids go to school. Does the middle class kid have an advantage over a poor working class kid? Yes. The teacher's middle class or uppity mobile. That's even worse because then she really or he's middle class. What are they teaching? They're teaching a middle class curriculum. Well, that's okay because the middle class curriculum includes a lot of knowledge that you probably are going to need if you're going to be middle class or go higher. And so you just go through that whole thing, and I take it to death. The person down below dies 4 or 5 years earlier than the person above that line. And that person below that line maybe dies a miserable life at home or in some kind of hospice thing that's not very nice, where the middle class person is probably allowed to die with some dignity. And so I said the inequality starts at the very beginning. And I said that child had, sometimes people act as if being born in the middle class was one of their great accomplishments, that they were, I said, and I've used something like this. You say you're the little baby in the stork being floated around trying to find a place to drop you. And you could keep pointing out that's a working class neighborhood, that's a ghetto. No, get me over here, and put me there, drop me in that house. And you don't have that choice. You're born in that house. That's where you are, and
Right.
now that's your fate. And just think about how it works for people going through that life cycle, and how hard it is to move up that across that line. And you can easily fall down, but you're going to have a sort of automatic advantage being born into a middle class household with resources to support you and keep you going, and get you into some kind of college, and get you a degree, and maybe use
Well, right. And
networks.
I think what was most important that I found to be a problem, and this actually kind of brings me back to like something that you said earlier. Like these people become very lined up to very specific areas. They only want to discuss sociology regarding race. They only want to discuss sociology regarding gender or whatever. And that there's this bigger picture that's so much more important. Um, I one of my friends was a guy named Jacques Fresco, and he studied social engineering and stuff like that, hoping to try to help society with it. But one of the things that he opposed was, and I don't want to say opposed, it's more like he recognized that it could be counterproductive. He basically said that he wasn't into what he would call specific group grievance activism, because what he found was, and just like us, he's like, it's not that racism or all that is not important. It's that if you find, he says, basically what happens is you set out on your one group's issue thinking that you're going to make the world a better place, and then eventually over time you start to get to a point where you're so devoted to that that it starts to become more important than literally anything else you're doing, and it ends up being you end up getting to a point where basically your concern for that one group becomes more important than your concern for how what you're doing may in any way cause problems for any other group. Instead of just having a unified idea of how do we make humanity as a whole better, you're only focused on one group. And unfortunately, as a consequence of that, in some cases, it literally leads to just like heading down a dark path and to just open bigotry against anybody who's not part of your group. Like I just had a little while ago, there was a professor named Brittany Cooper, who has done TED Talks on the issues of like critical race theory and such. And she went on The Root, which is a Black Issues YouTube channel, to answer questions about critical race theory. And a lot of the stuff that she said was just flagrantly racist. It was, basically that she said stuff that in many cases was just fictional. This is where, like, what you're talking about regarding why, like, so much of the research is bad is so critical to understand is that she was saying things like people of color never engaged in imperialism or slavery before Caucasians showed up. Like, that's just flagrantly wrong. And
Yeah.
you can accomplish equality and you can better lives of people of color without making stuff up. And that's where we run into a problem. Like, you mentioned earlier that that so much of the research was so poorly done. Can you give us some examples of that? And obviously, if you want to respond to anything I just said, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to give a specific names, but the
No, no, that's fine. Just describe the
if
overall,
you
like
just
what kind of
go
bad
down,
stuff.
if you go, if you you know, if anyone now says just go down the list of last year's meeting in Los Angeles of the American Sociological Association. Look at the program and look at the titles, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And such a large proportion of the program now is devoted to that. And I jotted down, for something I was writing. Maybe it was this political relevant discipline article. The titles of the presidential address of ASA. And it's not recall back then, but the number would still be right. If we took the last 10 ASA presidential addresses, and the theme is set by the person who's elected as president, they set the theme. 8 of them have been blatantly about ethnicity and gender and inequality. That's it. And that's all that person wants to talk about. And I think that's probably all that person knows. And that's the tragedy, is that this kind of hunkering down into silos of people studying race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, inequality. That's all they learn. Is that little bit of sociology. That's about that much of sociology. I don't know if I can see my finger.
Oh yeah, I can
Hands.
see it.
Yeah, but sociology is a big wide field like that, and everyone's like that. So what we're really producing now is a bunch of ignoramuses. They really don't know much. Most PhD students now, when they get their PhD, don't know that much. They have gone under the wing of someone who is sort of oriented to a particular narrow line of inquiry, very likely related to broader justice issues. And they've learned what that person takes and read certain things, but they haven't read very broadly. They haven't read outside of that field. And sociology has been reducing its general requirements for theory and methods and statistics and things that would make someone a competent sociologist generally before they over specialize, specialize in a particular area.
So
So
that would
those
be like,
requirements have been
say you're
going
fixing
away. And
cars
so
and
now
the
that
only
all
thing
you're
you
learning
know.
now
Go
is
ahead,
a
go ahead.
very narrow literature
Right.
of, hundreds instead of thousands of things, just a few hundred articles at most, or a few books. That may be all someone's read in graduate school. As long as they spouted the politically correct thing the professor expected, they will do okay. And that's been slowly occurring. And that trend, somewhere over the 50 years, that was occurring. And I think it really began to occur at an accelerated rate in the 1980s. And so that's that's where we are now. That there's a general resistance by students to learning things they don't want to learn. Theory,
I want to
methods,
take a quick
statistics.
second to interject just to
They
kind of
never wanted to
clarify.
learn those things. They never wanted to learn those things. But
Yep.
if you're going to be a sociologist, you have to know those things. But we have a lot of people who don't know those things. They know some wonderful cliches, and they're not inaccurate cliches or portrayals. They're probably justified in many ways about a particular subpopulation of which they're a member.
Right.
And that's all they're interested in, themselves and their fellow sufferers and victims of discrimination.
Well, and
And
then it's important to note that this would be like saying you're a mechanic, but the only thing you know how to fix is the starter. Like, or you only know how to fix, like, you only know how to change oil. Like, sociology is supposed to be a science of all humans interacting with each other, and to only understand one piece of it kind of, I mean, yeah, it's important to have like extra information maybe about one group or another, but if you don't have general sociological knowledge, it isn't going to work. It would be like saying I'm a psychologist, but the only thing I know about is schizophrenia. You can never get away with that. And it will cause all kinds of problems down the road. And that's actually kind of what Fresco is trying to point out. If you become so central focused on just your one group, you can't see the totality. You can't see the
well, that's
big picture.
that's the problem now. And now, of course, once you've got a department full of people over specializing in one discipline, one subdiscipline, they have voting power and they're able to perpetuate themselves. And then they also become quite threatened by someone who actually knows something beyond the sort of little cliche of recycled articles and phrases that particular subfields use. And I get no sense that sociology, even in fact, in the areas where there's all this concentration of effort on basically these gender, ethnicity, race, sexuality issues, I don't see a lot of new knowledge coming out. I mean, I do read those things, seeing anything new coming out, and I don't see anything that I already didn't know. And it's a more descriptive thing about yet one more subpopulation or situation, or it's just a general diatribe about racism and sexism and whatnot. And so in some ways, the damage has already been done to sociology, but I think there's a larger damage being done to academia because the administrations of campuses, administrators, deans, and provosts, and chancellors and presidents, all caved in on these issues. They don't have any kind of backbone, and so they go along and sort of quivering and shivering that someone might call them a racist, and so they allow a tremendous amount of inappropriate behavior on the part of people in these areas. I mean, I know this for a fact because I was in a department where we had certain individuals constantly charging other individuals with inappropriate behavior, never winning anything because there was never anything about it. But just playing games, academic games like that, so that if you challenge my ignorance and my sole focus on this one issue, and ask, do I know anything else? Their response is to call you a racist or a sexist or something or other.
Right.
And
A blasphemer.
that gets a little tiring, and especially for me when I look at all the people who are accusing me of this. They've never been off a college campus in their life and never risked their life for civil rights, and yet here they are preaching to sophomores as if they were great heroes. They're just sort of goody academics who staggered through graduate school, learned the cliches they need to learn to pass themselves off as quote expert, close quote, in something. But it's not one of the. It's usually not a hard area like methods or stat or theory. It's almost always in this one area, and so it's become an easy PhD to get. I would imagine it's getting a job in sociology maybe getting harder, but who knows? There must be enough classes, enough students who want to take sociology so that there's always a room. But the point is, departments are getting overloaded with people specializing in this one set of areas and underloaded in just about every other area in sociology. And if you try to bring someone else in other areas in, it's very hard to do. The deans aren't willing to do it because they're cowardly. They don't want to be called racist and sexist. And the presidents are standing as far away from that issue as they possibly can. And so what happens is you get people recruiting people. Excuse my sneeze. People with very narrow interests and very narrow bands of knowledge, recruiting similar people with the same interests as the several narrow bands of knowledge. And then once they become collectively a group, they can systematically work to keep other people from ever getting into a department that might broaden the intellectual horizons of the department. That would be the fair thing to do for students, for God's sake. So
Well,
students
and when you
don't know.
describe it like this, it just reminds me of like a church that's been divided up into denominations. And that's why I also use the example of like blasphemy and heresy, because that's what you're being accused of if you don't like what they're saying. And unfortunately, with an equal amount of scientific vigor to the to the inquisitions and the witch hunts, which are all obviously based in religion and not in fact, that's where we come to a real problem, because you can silence anyone who dares oppose you, and if you suggest that you have science that they don't like, then they can claim that your science is racist or sexist, meaning literally the studies themselves. Like, I run into that, for example. The only thing I've ever had my life threatened for and been doxxed over was doing a video discussing the actual biological science involved with whether or not trans athletes have advantages in sports. Like, all I did was share what the studies were, and for that they targeted me. And I'm not asking you to take a position on that specific point because it's not relevant to sociology, but it's an example of what I mean, where they really want it's like, okay, so that this is what Fresco is trying to warn about, which is that if you become more interested in your group and the benefit of your group than you are in actually seeking the truth, you're going to corrupt the entire process. You're actually not going to help anyone in the long run. It'll cause all kinds of problems for you and for the group you think you're trying to help, if it doesn't cause you to become the very thing that you sought to oppose. That was one of the other things he was pointing out, is that he's seen feminists go way down the rabbit hole to the point that they just outright hate men. It's not about raising women to equality. It's about, putting men down. And then the same thing happens to people who become obsessed with only race or become obsessed with only this issue or that issue. But coming back to the really critical point, we talk about the quality of it. It's also in psychology, for example. I assume you're familiar with the replication crisis, that they did a study trying to replicate psychology studies to find, and came to find out that they only like half of them would even actually pass replication. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I didn't read that. I don't know about the study. It's not surprising. We need more of that, by the way. The replication studies there's not, you don't get a lot of credit for them, but they're very important, because if you have a finding that you think is important and then can't replicate it, then maybe it's not a finding, and you better think about it. But not that wouldn't happen, because if the finding fits a political bias, it's good and it's sacred and it can't be ever refuted, basically, because that's what people believe. And whether you're a Marxist or a Maoist or a gender fanatic or an advocate of certain justices for certain categories of persons, if you won't accept any data that says what you're saying is maybe not quite right, you don't reject it. You don't reject it with your data. You just reject it with epithets and political flurries to try to hurt people who would challenge your hegemony. And that's what's happening in departments now. And I think a lot of faculty just shut up and just try to get along and just do their thing. And that's the worst mistake you could make, because that just empowers people. And but I watched it happen in my own department. As long as I was there, as the most senior and the longest term faculty member, I knew everyone on campus. I had a certain capacity to stop things getting out of hand. There was always tensions in the department. But when I finally realized I couldn't get the rest of the faculty who were still the majority to stand up and say, you can't let people just push you around like this.
Right.
And they said, "Oh, we can work it out. We can work it out." Well, they worked it out to almost oblivion, and essentially putting the department in receivership and not being allowed to take in any graduate students for 2 years. That's pretty much the death knell of a PhD program, and that's a shame. And there have been 3 presidents of the American Sociological Association who have been at UC Riverside at one time. It's a department that's been very successful, but now it's in receivership, and there was some talk of trying to put it into 2 different departments. I guess activist sociology and scientific sociology.
Right.
But the activists are resisting that because they know darn well what will happen. Most of the students will go to the scientific route. Most
Right.
students hate a lot of these courses. They consider them an imposition on them that they're forced to take. And it's not a bad idea that they learn something about ethnicity. I think it's not a bad idea to force that kind of requirement on students so they get some exposure. But I'd say in a sociology department today, the majority of students want to learn something that'll be useful in a career. And the activists are actually on the wrong side of student sentiment. It's just that students don't have any power to say anything, and the faculty who's willing to expend all their energy politicizing around the department, as opposed to writing things and doing research, that they always have an advantage because they've got a limited time. And if you want to try to write and publish, and your time to fight those battles is very limited. And it gets in the way of your work. And so that's what everyone does. They retreat. So when they retreat, they lose because they won't fight. When they fight, they outnumber. They can outvote. But it just was I watched it happen, and that was the reason I decided I am retiring. Now, I wish I'd known how much I'd enjoy retirement. I would have retired a decade earlier.
Right.
I would have just continued doing what I'm doing now, which I'm having a wonderful time in life of writing and not having to worry about all the crap in the department and having to deal with that stuff.
Well,
And
unfortunately, the ramifications in the long run, which is why I think inevitably you're going to find yourself, like you said, you can write. So that's, it's hard to shut something like this off. But like when I had Peter Boghossian on recently, we discussed like the replication crisis, and then I also brought you up to him. I'm hoping that he'll bring you on his show, and I'd love it if you could talk to Jordan Peterson. I think he would find what you're saying extremely important. Is that we use sociology and psychology to help us understand humans, and reality and how we perceive reality. We pass laws based on psychology and sociology. We assign, like for psychology, we assign people's therapeutic like prescriptions essentially, based upon what we are finding in these studies. And if they're not replicable, and if they're completely, totally screwed up with people's opinions and not with actual scientific and vigor, then we come into a real problem, because that's a serious threat to all of humanity. If we get to a point, that's why, like, I mentioned earlier, if you care more about your cause than you do about telling the truth, that sounds all well and good in the short term, but in the long term, what are the consequences going to be? It's like, if you had a certain view on, say, a material science, and you tried to just use your opinion about it, or had some kind of emotional attachment to what you wanted, like say in engineering, well, let's say you have an emotional attachment to building a house in the shape of a pyramid. And then because you're so emotionally attached to it, you start creating fake papers, that are just mostly opinion, doing shoddy research to prove your theory. Then people move into your house and then they get killed because the house collapses on itself because you used shoddy science. All of that is equally true in social sciences. especially like, I mean, this is one example I brought up to Peter Boghossian. I'm not asking you to take a stance on it, but it's an example like when the spanking thing became an issue in child psychology. One of the main papers that was getting passed around, come to find out that they took the data from kids who had just been paddled in the more traditional sense, and then they stuck it in the same data set as kids who were brutally beaten, and then said, see, all spanking leads to the following detrimental outcomes. Like, that's something you could never get away with in a material science. Never. And like, so, but they had an emotional attachment to saying spanking is wrong. And it's like, so then go through the scientific vigor and come up with the real stuff. Don't just make things up or do things you intentionally know are bad faith because you have a certain outcome you want. That's why I said it ends up just sounding like a bunch of people arguing over a religion. But anyway, go ahead and comment on that.
Well, I think that's true. I think right now, those courses that are offered are very weak courses. They're heavily loaded with ideology and political viewpoints, and they don't even do justice to the subject matter. They ignore a good many of the theories that would actually explain things in favor of some more politically correct kinds of theoretical images. I can't even say these things are coherent theories, but they're sort of images. And so the result is, it's too late for sociology. Sociology is not dead. It'll always exist, even in its present form, because there are enough students who want to take the courses. But the best example I have is when I wrote the Possible Science of Steve Turner. I think the highest rate of membership of the American Sociological Association, I'm just guessing at the numbers here now, was about 17,000 members. And today, 10 years later, sociology has about half that. So half the people who were professional sociologists who belonged to ASA have dropped out. My wife, who is also a sociologist, when we signed up again to join ASA, we almost didn't sign up. But it was cheap, it was only $75 for retired people, so we did it. But there's going to come a time, and not too distant future, where we won't sign up. It's not, the meetings are not worth going to. We were still actively engaged sociologists. I'm writing probably as much as anyone else is, and as a full-time job in sociology. And I don't even want to go to the meetings.
Well, what a sad state of affairs that is, that you're literally a guy who was in the trenches in the civil rights movement back when being an activist was something that actually was a serious threat to your life, because they weren't treating people in the civil rights movement with the kid gloves that activists get treated with nowadays. You're a left-leaning guy. You care about people of color. You care about gay people. You care about women. You care about all of these issues. And now you can't even be involved, even though you still care about all of those things, because you also do care about the truth and the scientific vigor being followed so that we actually have credibility. Like, it really is. It's frightening to me when you say that sociology is like essentially on its deathbed, because sociology has been so important for us to understand how things like the rise of the Third Reich happened, to understand how different social contagions have happened over the years, how groups of people can be manipulated by people with nefarious purposes. That's all sociology helping us understand those things. That's critical self-defense for our society as a whole. And if we and then if we get to the point where psychology, and unfortunately I think it's probably headed there given the replication prices, becomes in such a sad state as what you're talking about with sociology, well, then we're going to have people just telling us, well, you don't agree with me, so therefore you are clinically insane. Like that's the next direction. Like you
Well,
talked about. Go ahead.
Psychology is better than often sociology. It has well, one of the big problems of psychology is it's over specialized. But one of the things that's helping it survive this onslaught because there are all these silos of highly specialized work with research traditions and journals, and so people are able to function as psychologists. Sociology never over specialized as much as psychology, but it's broader. It's a much broader field. Psychologists in the end study behavior. Sociologists study behavior in all its aspects and interaction in all its aspects and patterns of social organization in all its aspects. So it's a very broad field to begin with. But now it's becoming a very narrow field. And you've got all these sort of satellite things that are actually the majority, the vast majority of what is sociological is hardly being studied anymore. Because most young academics are into these various categories of inequality that they're obsessed about, and because they themselves have been victims of oftentimes of this discrimination, they're quite passionate about it, and so it's very hard to reach them. On the argument I would make that expand your horizons, try to be value neutral, learn as much as you can, and communicate it as best you can to your fellow sociologists and to your students. And you don't need to be a rabble rouser because the ideas themselves are revolutionary to young people. They haven't thought about them all very much because the sociology is not offered in high school. What it is, it's not very good.
Right.
And so it's sad, and so that's why I think I mentioned earlier that I have trouble knowing what to call myself, because I don't want to call myself a sociologist because that's embarrassing to me. I'm embarrassed to be a sociologist, not because I haven't done decent sociology. I'm embarrassed for the field, what it's become. It's become rather useless and harmful, and we're going to have to reinvent sociology under another name. And I prefer the name social physics, the original name for sociology. But I literally don't call. If someone asks me what I am, I generally say I'm a theoretical social scientist. I just don't want to be identified as sociology to be, of course, because what sociology has become is a very mediocre discipline. And it's going to be worse and worse and worse and worse. And some of the old specialties are staying in there because they're really well insulated. Things like social psychology and sociology of culture, and these sections that have good memberships, they got their own little world, so they can withstand this kind of attack. But but in their departments, it's very hard to overcome this onslaught of shift in the interests of sociologists and what they're willing to tolerate, and the anti-science attitudes that have come in, and then activism for its own sake is just somehow that is considered a noble academic profession to be an activist. That's ridiculous. If you want to be an activist, be an activist. Get out there and change the world. But beware, people are going to kill you, want to kill you.
And
They
I
don't want to do
consider,
that. They want to be safe in the ivory tower, purely safe, and trying to and engage in great conversion movements of sophomores. That's not a particularly noble thing. Educating a sophomore who doesn't know very much is a very important thing to be done. Just throwing a few things down a sophomore's throat and says, "You spelt this and you're okay. You'll get an A." That's the worst thing that can happen to that sophomore. That sophomore will not be won't get the benefit of a real sociological education. It's sad, and I grieve over it. I've got mad over it. I've stopped over it, and I'm sure I'm not alone as a sociologist. People I feel sorry for are young sociologists and mid-career sociologists who are scientists who are trying to find a way and a place to do their work. It's very hard. It's a hostile environment now. And so, you know, they're late 30s, and they've still got 40 years to go
Oh man.
of intellectual work, maybe, and they have no peace and quiet. They're just in a hostile environment. I feel that's what I feel so sad about the law. And then I see this the sadness about the loss of the knowledge. It's just gonna, the only thing that's saving the knowledge is the internet makes us all immortal. I'm just amazed what the things that are referenced that I've written, you know, from 50 years ago. Someone in the world still finding those things and citing them. I can't believe it's, but that's good because that means it won't all be lost, but it's going to have to be rediscovered. We're going to have archaeologists of sociology going in 100 years and finding out what happened to sociology. And all this knowledge was lost. Look at all the knowledge that was lost. Here we are. We have it on the internet. We can see
It's
it.
like a
There it
dark
is.
ages. It's like a dark ages. That
We're
means like
going
an
into a dark,
archaeologist of
literally into a
sociology.
dark
Oh my
ages.
goodness.
Exactly. You know, this could be
Oh
the
man.
this could be the restoration. You know, it's very similar, and it's very dangerous. It's harmful to academia in general. It's terribly harmful to students because they become ignoramuses. They don't know anything, and they're full of anger and vigor without any real knowledge about the complexity of the issues that they're mad about.
Well, and
And
I think that, there's a couple of key things that I think are really important to point out. One of them I bring up all the time. I don't know if you're familiar with what happened to Brett Weinstein at Evergreen College, but he was subject to one of these, Inquisition witch hunts that are the reasons why so many of these professors you're talking about just are basically cowering in fear because they don't want this to happen to them. But at one point, he was talking to one of the students who was basically caught up in this witch hunt, and the guy literally looked at him and said, "You have to stop demanding that people use logic and reason and white forms of knowledge." Like, they identified the scientific method as being part of white culture. So you're going to tell the guy, well, you don't believe you're racist, but we believe you are racist, and you have to stop demanding that people use logic and reason. Now, this all plays into warnings, and this is relevant because you and I both are left leaning. George Orwell was just a flat out socialist, and he wrote 1984 and he wrote Animal Farm as warnings to other left leaning people that if you're not careful, these kinds of things can take control. But one of the things he said in one of his own personal writings was that if you run into a situation where there are a group of people who want to eliminate the concept of objective truth, like you were talking about the anti science people, for example, if you're trying to eliminate objective truth, then that's a sign that some kind of authoritarian something is trying to take control of your society. And whether or not that's true or not, it doesn't change the fact that the idea of eliminating objective truth and making it all about what we want to feel, like what we would really like to be true, and that's more important than anything, to the point that we're willing to do stuff like that's why I brought on Peter Boghossian, because he did the Grievance studies affair I discussed with you earlier, that you can now just intentionally create fraudulent studies that suit the purposes of your ideology and what you want to believe to be true, and that they will get published and then they will get cited. There was a perfect example of this in my local school district. They circulated this flyer, and the flyer cited several studies, but it did so in a very selective way. The point of the flyer was to suggest to everyone that white children, and apparently only white children, are born racist. And it went along all these different studies to suggest that that was the case, going all the way down to like when they were born, the first 3 months, and it scales up from there. So I went and actually read the papers, and there were several things that the people who were trying to make that point left out. One of them was a lot of the studies that they were citing were literally only done on white children in the first place. So, in other words, there was no basis of comparison. We didn't know if Black children or Hispanic children or Asian children tended to prefer their own race at, say, 3 months old, because the study was never done on anybody else. So instead, they just dishonestly presented the information and said, well, it shows here that white children and only white children believe this. In another one of the studies that they cited, it also showed that kids preferred playmates who had the same accent as them, and that was more important than the race of the child. So, in other words, a white child may choose to play with a black child who had the same accent as opposed to, say, another white child who had a British accent or a Southern accent. But again, that information doesn't make it into the flyer because that doesn't work with what they're trying to do. So at that point, they're willing to cherry pick if they're not just outright being fraudulent in the first place to try to achieve their goal, which is to convince people in general that you need to allow us to show up in your school district and give these trainings. And if you don't agree with anything I'm about to say, then you have white fragility, because that was another part of it. Is they did a book study, kind of a compulsory book study, where they forced the entire faculty to read Robin DiAngelo's book. And then that preps you, because then at that point you have the perfect gaslighting. You could just say, well, if you don't agree with anything we're saying, you need to be aware of your white fragility. And that could be the real reason why you don't agree with these things. So all of that stuff is an example of, at this point, you're citing or claiming to cite scientific studies to affect a policy change. And that sort of thing is going on well beyond just elementary schools and middle schools. It's making its way into lawmakers, in Congress and the Senate, and it's making its way to the out of the mouths of presidents. And they trust scientists. They trust social scientists to be telling them the truth. They trust us to be following the scientific method to ensure that the things that we are saying are actually factually correct. And that's where I think that's where is society in general, like you said, it's a dark ages. It is a dark ages, and the dark ages were not a pleasant time. Like, do we want to go back to a point where we don't understand that? That's why I brought up the Third Reich, because it's a perfect example that Hitler used certain strategies to get large quantities of people to agree to do horrible things. Do we want to not have that information? And more importantly, do we not want to present it accurately? Because now we just call everybody who disagrees with us a fascist, obviously. But that's an example of what I'm getting at. And it's so vital that people like you sounded the alarm. I mean, this article that I've left up here because I want my viewers to read it. You did this in 2019, but you said it had been going on for over 20 years. And, it's only now kind of getting into public consciousness. We've kind of been just allowing scientists to do this. And it gets worse when, as I pointed out when I just did my show with Peter Boghossian, was then these people get tenure and then they start writing our textbooks. And then our textbooks have all of this, this politics and activism in them, presented as if it was truth. Like, that is
Well,
absolutely terrifying. Go ahead.
it's too late. It's here. I mean, I don't think there's any saving sociology. I think it's gone. Half the presidents of the association I've never even heard of. They have very mediocre records. They're getting, there's an insider group nominating these people and putting them up, and it's over. So many of my colleagues don't really realize that. It's time for them to realize it's over. It's time to do your sociology and find a way to get your sociology out to the world. Don't expect your fellow sociologists to help you along, because most of them hate your guts because you won't buy into their simplistic view of the world. And that's the way it is. And I think you're right. The knowledge we're producing now is not really good knowledge. It's not very rigorous. Sociology, if anything, used to be pretty rigorous with research, and there's still people doing really good research, but they're not the ones that are being listened to anymore. That's just reality. So the only solace I take in all this is that while the kind of thing that I do in American sociology is not something that people particularly like. First of all, because it's hard,
Right.
and it actually takes some real work, not just facile work of just uttering a bunch of utopian cliches. Um, but around the world, what I find, just listening to my email and people who write me about things, and all these services now tell you who's reading your stuff. Uh, I think I think a majority of sociologists in the world don't feel the way most Americans do. Europeans have sort of started to go the American route, but the rest of the world has not, because sociology is too important to them, because it's actual knowledge about the social world that they might be able to use to reconstruct a better world for themselves. And most people who are sociologists don't live in a very good world. They live in a poor world, or they don't have much access to resources. And so there's that. There's that. So I think it's certainly Western sociology is corrupted in a terrible way, and I don't know if it'll ever come back as sociology. It may have to come back under some other name.
That actually kind of is a good segue to this super chat from one of my regular viewers. Lucifer the Doberman says, "What will be needed to create an enlightenment in sociology? Is there anything we could do? I mean, I guess maybe just keep our records, and keep the information and make sure it doesn't get destroyed, so that those sociological archaeologists we were talking about can discover it." But so you feel that it's over? Do you feel that what would we have to do to bring it back to life?
I don't think we can bring it back as the way it's currently constructed, because there's the way all the scientists are dropping out. Clearly, they're dropping out, and so they're not there to vote for memberships and for setting, being on the council that decides about all kinds of policies for ASA. So it's gotten completely away from the scientists. So the administrative apparatus is controlled by the activists. And then that wasn't necessarily a bad case. There are many really good activists who are presidents of ASA and who were serious sociologists who were activists, and they could do both. They could do decent science, and they could actually do activism. I found, for my purposes of teaching, that's one of the main reasons I stopped it, bringing any of the activism I was involved in, because I wanted to reach every student, not just the students who have my biases. I wanted to reach the students that don't have my biases, because I always felt they can learn something from sociology, but not sociology dressed up as an ideology, but sociology dressed up as a science, which has knowledge that's useful. And that's no longer the case. It's still being produced. It's just hard to find. It's not going to be sitting in ASR and elite journals anymore. They've been taken over. Fortunately, there's a lot of journals, so it's not hard to get your work published. And fortunately, the internet has made almost every journal eventually accessible by everyone else in the world. And my mail tells me that there are people who are reading the kinds of things that I write. They're just not European. Eastern Europeans do, but the Western Europeans and Americans, they don't read this kind of stuff, or stuff by people like I am, who are of that older generation that's on the way out, but we're still here, we're alive, and we're still working, but we haven't got forever. And so I don't know there's anything we can do now. If we can find a university whose administrators had some courage, there could be things, but they're part of the problem. The deans and the provosts and the chancellors are all scared to death that they'll be called racist, or that they'll lose their NSF funding or something. So they just kowtow to this kind of political correctness and do the university real harm. They don't have the courage, because they don't want to have to fight the battle that you have to fight now. It's a battle now. It's not just a matter of ignoring people and just doing your work. It's you have to actually fight them, because they're playing pretty dirty politics, so the politics of the university. And you've got to fight back if you're going to survive. And in 73, I said, it's not worth fighting these people anymore. I got some things I want to write before I die, and maybe I've got a decade or so of that, and I'm getting closer into that decade now, so that I don't want to fight this battle anymore. The only thing I'm doing is it forced me to start. It's not available yet, but it's about to come on as my blog,
Right.
and I call myself a social physician, social physicist, and it's about the blog is probably going to have the title Social Physics, and I'm going to push that way because that gets around. That'll get around the world eventually once people learn about it. It's
When you
just
finally do get that done, let me know and I'll make sure that all my viewers know
yeah.
about it and we start
Yeah,
spreading awareness.
it's I've got the original parts to it, but I'm relying upon. At 80 years old, I'm not real computer illiterate. To me, this computer is still just a cool typewriter, and allows me to do a lot of corrections easily and stuff. But I have never figured out how to do stuff. So my granddaughter and her engineering father have organized, got it pretty much all together. It's going to come up eventually in the next month or two, and it'll have a lot of content. Then once I have it there, I can start adding content. And
So, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you, this is more of a personal question, not about my life personally, but it has to do with something I've always wanted to talk to a sociologist about. But it was, in this case, a social physicist will have to do. um, so I watched
theoretical social
the
science, that's a mouthful, but
right, exactly. I watched the documentary by Adam Curtis that was called The Century of the Self, and he was explaining the work of Edward Bernays, who apparently was asked by elite people, how do we socially engineer society to become a consumer society? Have you ever watched that documentary, or are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
I'm not familiar with it. No, no, no.
Oh, okay. Well, I
Well,
guess then that part of it will be kind of brief. It was just the
I
idea
think
was
one
is
of the
that go ahead, go ahead.
oh, I think the a book that I wrote in 20 published in 2021, I would sort of because, I'll give you the title, then I'll say why I think it's relevant to this kind of issue. It's called Human Nature: The Biology and Sociology of What Made Us Human. So one of the things I've been very interested in now for the last 30 years, actually, even though I'm a theorist, I have all kinds of little specialty areas that I work in and I enjoy. One of the ones I enjoy is bringing biology back into sociology. You think that's keeping the activists at bay is a project, trying to get sociologists who have all these prejudices against biology, first of all, because it's a real science, and that's kind of hard. And but more importantly, there's a lot of historical reasons why, for all abuses of biological ideas in the past, eugenics and stuff like that, uh, they're suspicious of it. But it's important because one of the things that's always going to be difficult for humans, and this book has, because my wife's a primatologist, and we've written a whole bunch of books together on going back and looking at, you got to remember, we share 99 plus of our genes with chimpanzees and 98 plus with gorillas and about 97 plus with orangutans. In other words, they are genetically very close to us.
Right.
And so they're our best idea of what humans were before the brains grew and got culture and we began to create larger social structures. If we want to know what we were like as a biological species, that's the data on the behaviors and organization of the great apes are the best proxy to that knowledge. We could actually, literally like the Hubble or Webb telescope, look back 5 million years in human history and see what we were like. They're sitting right there in a common chimpanzee. And so if you know how they operate and how they organize, it makes it difficult to change things. One Great apes are very individualistic. They don't have any permanent structures except for a broader sense of community. So the only hardwired in our genome sense of social structure is this larger community or home range that all great apes have. It could be 20, 30 square miles. But none of the great apes creates permanent groups. They have temporary groups, but an awful lot of time, great apes are just walking around their territory, hooking up and having a conversation, and walking on. And so that's what we are, underlying biologically. And you expose that, and we all our social structures are created. There's no biological basis for them. The nuclear
And that
family does not exist in great apes.
and that makes a lot of sense. In addition to the fact that I remember had these same conversations with Jacques Fresco. Was just that it seems like one of humanity's biggest problems is that we are arrogant enough to believe that these sorts of natural forces that exist in nature, whether it's herd politics, alpha male politics, or whatever, that we are still completely susceptible to all of that. And we as humans can become cognitive of those things to try to curb their impact on us, but that all of those kinds of instincts still exist within our psyche. And if we ignore them, we do so at our peril. Like we tend to believe that we're too good for herd politics or whatever. But I remember, for example, just like peer pressure itself seems to be a situation of, well, if I were living in a hunter-gatherer society, if I ended up ostracized by the group, it's not just a matter of I wouldn't have any friends. I could very easily end up dead. So
You
that
would
would
end up,
create. I'm sorry, go ahead.
you would end up dead. You would end up dead.
And so then
And
that
that's
means that if you can control somebody of being rejected by the social group, you can exert enormous amounts of control over them. And we tend to think, well, that doesn't apply to us. I'm like, no, it absolutely does. I mean, you watch it play out in total viciousness. For example, like, my son is going through high school right now. And it's an interesting phenomenon to observe in the school system because it's like somebody is passing this on to them in some way, but kids can be so vicious with each other, and it can exert enormous amounts of control over what clothing you wear, what music you listen to, like and that's why, again, it comes back to why sociology is so goddamn important, is that we need to understand that these social forces exist and that they can control us, and that that they could also be used for good. You could do things to try to help society have a more healthy way of interacting with each other.
well,
But yeah, go
that's
ahead.
the point. We don't have any genetic basis for social structures except for community. Uh, they're social constructions. We've created them because we had to create them to survive. And the good news about that is that you can change those structures. We're not finding any hardwired propensity. You try to make a monkey leave its natal community, a female monkey leave the natal community, you can never get that. They're very group oriented. Great apes have these very loose structures because we actually lost out of the competition for monkeys in the forest. So the monkeys had all the verdant areas where there's structural support and food at the core of the trees in the African forest. Great apes, who were smarter and more intelligent and bigger, but they couldn't compete with monkeys because monkeys could eat unripe fruit and great apes couldn't. And so they were pushed to the terminal feeding areas of the forests, way high up in the trees, high wire act up there. One false step and you're dead by gravity.
Right.
And you cannot have a lot of great apes hanging out up in the high of the trees. They're big animals. They weigh 100 pounds. And you have to have very low density. So you have to have a mechanism, a hardwired mechanism, making you transfer out away from your natal community every generation. And so there's no continuity across generations. All female great apes and two of the three male species of great apes, gorillas and orangutans, the males all leave their natal group at puberty, never to see them again. They
Right.
move out to another community. And they keep doing that because you can't have high densities that way up high in the forest. There's no food, there's no structural support, and the chances of falling down when you're crowded up there are very high. So that gives, but the fact that we don't have, like almost every other mammal, bioprogrammers for herding or schooling or forming packs and other kinds of group structures, which most mammals have hardwired bioprogrammers for that. Humans don't, except for this general sense of community. That's why people always have attachments to their hometowns and stuff, because there is something biological there. The rest of it we're creating. And that's the most important thing we have to know, that we can recreate what's bad. That activism can work if you know exactly how to go about changing a situation and a structure. But if ideology is guiding you, you can't accept facts that go against your ideology. So once you're committed to an ideology, you're committed to being ignorant about maybe solutions that can help solve a problem that you're concerned about. And somehow sociologists have lost this. They think that if they're politically correct and have the right ideology, they can impose it on everybody. But quite frankly, most of their ideologies, the kinds of structures that they try to create, are not viable. We're still individualistic human beings. We're a very individualistic species.
And
Probably
it's
one of the most.
interesting that in so doing what they're doing, ironically, the fascist boogeyman that they're so scared of is exactly what they will become. Because
That's what they have become, and they're scary because the people who should be managing them, the deans and the provosts and the presidents of the universities, aren't doing it, and they're a cowardly bunch. And I have very little respect for most of them because they just cower and tolerate things that they shouldn't tolerate. So the point is, the beauty of humans, what's made us, the planet of the apes, couldn't have planet of the monkeys. Monkeys are too group oriented. Only apes could have 8 billion people and be able to organize at least two subpopulations into a billion plus societies. They could do that because we're pretty flexible. And what's happening in this, when you get a social movement that's got ideologically strong, you become inflexible. You become dogmatic. You can't go away from the flex. It's as if you had genes. You like having genes.
right.
It'd be worse to have genes that way, but we've always been flexible. We've been able to recreate social structures and culture so we can be more fit in our environment. And I think right now what's happened in sociology is to become so narrow and dogmatic, and it's a spiritual crusade that the intolerance of anyone who is not involved in that crusade damages the very people who are the better sociologists. And
So
they're leaving. They're dropping out of ASA. They're finding other jobs. The mid-career people are desperate to find a place where they can do their work and be left alone. And they're
unfortunately, that
not.
means that what would be the inmates will inevitably be running the asylum. I wanted to ask
Well, they
one
are. Well,
more
they already
thing.
are. You see, they already are in sociology. I mean, that's what
Right.
I'm saying. There were signs that this was going to happen 20 years ago. It was starting to happen, but it just happened so fast. And then by the time you really realize how entrenched this ideology has become, and how the demography of the field has come, so that many of the people who are in sociology were members of those categories who had been discriminated against. You can understand why they were interested in this sociologically, but they become dogmatic and want sociologists only to think about what they think about, as opposed to recognizing they're part of a much larger field that has a long history with a great deal of knowledge accumulated over time. They refuse to read that knowledge. That's the tragedy. They refuse to
So
read it.
no, in the end, because it doesn't fit. It's just because it's blasphemy. That's the work of
That's my
heretics.
point.
Yeah.
And so you can break things down. You can change people because there's no biology behind that dogmatism. That's just a straight dogmatism that humans can do once they get committed to an ideology. let me just read you, because there's a wonderful book to read. It's the best book I've read. It's Christian Smith's, I forget, something like Sociology, Spiritual Journey. And he says there's two sociologies, and I'm going to read you his description from a little table he has. And here it is. This is called American Sociology as a Justice and Emancipation Project. That's what currently American sociology is all about. The value laid in exposing, protesting, ending through social movement and governmental programs, all inequality, oppression, exploitation, suffering, injustice, poverty, discrimination, exclusion, hierarchy, constraint, and domination by or over other humans and perhaps even animals. Therefore, American sociology is a collective enterprise committed to visually realizing the emancipation, equality, and moral formation of all human beings as autonomous, self-directing agents who should be out to live their lives as they personally desire by constructing their own favorite identities, entering into existing relationships and choose the inequality, enjoy the gratification of experiential, marital, and bodily pleasures. That's it. Well, actually, once you have the ideologues running things, they're not very tolerant. You may not be able to have the fun things there that he mentioned at the end. Then he has the other juxtaposition is sociology as a science project, and he actually quotes me because I'm sort of pushing this for a long time. The value-neutral search and analysis of fundamental and generic properties of the social universe with the goal of developing and testing theories of their operative dynamics and using this knowledge thereby attained and applied applications to real-world conditions. Therefore, American sociology is a collective professional enterprise culminating in knowledge for its own sake as well as for its applications to the organizational problems actors face in the social universe. Now, my portrayal is an open one, and it's the one that should drive sociology. It's the one that students should be interested in. The other project, I share the emotions attached to any inequalities that are listed. I risked my life as a young man to see that people would have the right to vote. And I got myself thrown in jail in quite a few places. Jackson, Mississippi was one of my memorable events. And it was all coordinated by civil rights committees. So there was no real danger.
Right.
It was because people were pretty violent, especially when they have a white person marching with black people and yelling back at the hecklers. I was lucky I got out of my life, but at any rate. You're young, you do stupid things sometimes, but this is the thing that I believe morally I should do. But that had nothing to do with me as a sociologist. That was me as a human being, caring about other people. The sociology was never part of that. I wrote on it over the years, but it's not been my main area. But I've written several books on it. I wrote a history of black-white relations. I wrote the big textbook on American ethnicity, and maybe several dozen articles, but that's just a very small part of what I've written. And it wasn't my academic thing. And even though I taught the big American ethnicity course for many years, I was never involved with a group of people who were doing that because they were clearly going off this deep into the project to the Emancipation Justice Project. And so, but it's too late. And that's the sad part of the story. I think sociology has to now be reinvented. I don't know if we could ever convince a dean or a provost or a president, given that they're such cowards, to create a social physics department or a scientific sociology department and really mean it when they create a department like that. And put it alongside the other department. That's fine. It'll compete just fine. It'll outcompete the Emancipation Department easily because students want to know something,
right?
And then they have the right to know something when they go to college. They're paying for it. They should learn some knowledge they'll find useful in their careers and their lives. And but it's not going to happen in the current structure. And so sociology will limp along. It'll become worse and worse. There's nothing to stop it now because The graduate programs are all infested with this disease. The administrators, the deans who are overseeing these programs are all infected with this disease out of their own cowardice. And the result is that now a student who wants to do value-neutral sociology and enters the department, that student is going to be in a minority and it will be discriminated against. I guarantee you. And the fights that my students had to have at the end was unbelievable. Really talented students who have done nothing but make me proud and make the university proud, compared to all the ones who were persecuting, who we've never heard of again. But at any rate, that they were the last generation probably to be able to stand up to it. The pollution of the intellectual world of sociology is so great now. It's inconceivable that it can reverse itself. It just has to be recreated by a different name. And we have to find a few courageous people in academia who are willing to put the money down to create a new department of social physics, or whatever we want to call it.
Well, I do have, yeah, I totally agree. And I hope that that happens. And that's why I want to get you hopefully talking to some people with bigger platforms than I have. Like, Jordan Peterson would find everything you just said very fascinating. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to get a hold of him. I did reach out to Peter Boghossian about you, and I think Brett Weinstein would also be highly interested in what you're talking about. So if you guys are listening to this and any of you have the possibility of getting a hold of these people, like beyond even just what I can, please make sure that you share this man's work. There was one more sociological thing I wanted to discuss with you. And there was apparently a study that was actually asked for by the military, and this was actually reported about in mainstream media. So it's going to sound a little crazy, but it was on ABC News, it was in The Guardian, and etc. But the study basically came to the conclusion that if you can convince 25% of the population of a given society of something, that it will tend to create like a sociological chain reaction that will lead to a wider acceptance of that concept. And so in response to that, the military asked a software company to help them develop a software that would create masses of fake identities, like fake accounts on the internet, to try to sway public opinion. And the mainstream media caught them on this, and it came up again in the news recently. And of course, they said, well, we never use these sorts of things, in our own country. We only use them in third world countries or whatever, or like places like the Middle East. And I'm kind of like, yeah, sure. I'm sure nobody ever uses technology like this. But in regards to the issue of the 25%, and I don't know, obviously, I'm not going to ask you to comment on a study that you haven't yourself read, but does the concept of convincing 25% of a population leading to that chain reaction effect of wider acceptance, what would your take on that be? And do you feel that that is in concurrence with other things that you've learned throughout the years as a sociologist?
Well, I think for example, President Trump never really had more than about 20% of the vote, 25%, but that big a block allowed for a much bigger vote. It never was a majority vote, but what did with the presidency, once at least. Yeah, I think that if you have fellow travelers, it's a lot easier, and that's what's happening. You see, you got the reverse of that. As the scientific sociologists bail from sociology departments, or just quit, or find other places to be, or go work in the private sector or whatever, you increase that what used to be probably 20% of the sociologists were hardcore activists, committed to a kind of change the world attitude. But when they can begin to disrupt the lives of those scientists who are working hard and not being activists, but just doing science and just doing, keeping their nose to the ground. So as they start leaving, then the more activists come in, and the demography of sociology has changed dramatically. I mean, women outnumber men now. There's a very heavy minority constituency, and of course a whole constituency around gender, sex issues. And they're committed ideologically to something, and I can even I'm sympathy with their commitments, because all they're trying to do is, one way is get more equality. But what they're doing is creating a new inequality, and they're creating, as you pointed out, an intolerance that will just accelerate this process. That it's not 20% anymore, especially since half the people, the American Sociological Association, have left. And
Right.
so who's left? Them. And so they're going to win every election for any office or whatever. And so that's what's happened. So that's why I see that situation is not viable. The sociology can limp along as an activist department. My God, we've got ethnic studies and gender studies. These are all ideologically driven departments. And that's always the problem. When you take the ideology of a social movement, bring it in and try to make it an academic make it an academic discipline, it doesn't become an academic discipline. It's the activists in that convert it to an activist discipline. And that's what's happened to sociology.
So now I can get a
So,
PhD in my opinion.
well, you don't need a PhD to be an activist. Well, first of all, most of these students getting PhDs today, don't think know what even master's degree students do at one time. They're just getting a little small snippet of education, all biased by the prejudices of the mentors. And from their point of view, we're doing what we have to do to get our PhD. But when you get out there to have a job and you haven't learned anything, it's going to be hard. The only thing you can teach is what the bigotry you've learned. And you're not likely to be reading any new stuff because you haven't been reading new stuff very much. You've just been reading within the narrow field that you're now committed to. And now you're committed to it for the rest of your life. And I would think if I were those people, I'd die of boredom, because they don't know very much. They only know a little bit about ethnicity. They refuse to read anything that conflicts with their ideological points of view. And thus they're trapped. They've trapped themselves intellectually, and they're going to bore students to death. That's for sure. Students don't like these courses, like these activist courses. They're not. Some do, but the majority don't. Their parents they're paying good money for education. I don't want to be preached at. If I want to be preached at, I'll go to church.
Well, it's kind of like the power of the vocal, loud minority that shouts loud enough to create the illusion of being far more people than it actually is. And then the problem is that because of the fact that they're so good at that, we let them bend us to their will. For example, one of the things that this whole Twitter situation has finally proven was that they were elevating a certain ideological view to be the forefront, to make it look as though way more people agreed with it than actually did. And then the effect of that comes back to that 25% I was talking about, which I think also leads back to what we were talking about earlier when we were discussing herd politics. Like as if there's a decision that is made, like when you're in a school of fish, where you give up a little bit of your individuality because for whatever reason, the school of fish has all decided to go this way. So you better go with them, and we're not fish, but like that's a reflection of so many other phenomenon when it
Well,
comes to groups.
if you're in the situation, or even I, who been the sort of mainstay with my finger in the dike of this potentially calamitous uh, thing, just got tired of it. And it wasn't worth my effort anymore, especially when I couldn't get the people who agree with me to fight for themselves. And so they wouldn't fight, and they lost. They
Right.
lost their department. They lost their graduate students. They lost a lot. And I feel very badly about that, but it was up to them at some point. They were relying upon me and my ability to work informal networks to make sure that people didn't go overboard, and everyone else knew that I had that kind of power, informal power. But I think everyone eventually gives up. It's not that they just don't want to fight the fight anymore. It just gets in the way of your peace of mind in your life, and you can't do your work because you're always having to deal with these kinds of confrontational issues. And you know, the people who are on crusades want to stab you. And
Well, and
so,
eventually it gets to the point where they're not content to just disagree with you publicly. They want to get you fired from your job. They want to get you,
oh yeah, so they're doing
unpersoned.
incredibly. They're trying to do what they did in my department was they started uh, having graduate students go complain to deans about particular faculty. Um, and every time that happened, you really couldn't get the graduate student to redo it, but you'd get them to go there initially and create a bad impression.
Right.
And when you're subject to that kind of harassment, that's first of all chargeable. The University of California system. If someone had done that to me, they would be in charge. I would have my lawyer on them. They'd be charged. They'd be sent to charges committee. I've been chair of both these committees, charges committee, and I would say yes, there's reason here for a charge. And I would suggest the charge be loss of tenure for the people who are doing this. And I've been chair of privilege of tenure too, which is the committee would actually try the person. And I know you can win those battles because people, those committees tend to be sensible people because they're hard work committees. Activists don't want to be in committees like that because they actually involve a lot of work. Because you got a lot of time, you got to spend a lot of time doing that kind of stuff. And but no one did it, you know, out of just trying to be collegial or just not wanting to fight the battle. And if I have one thing if I regret, I should have charged people 20 years ago with some of the things they did. I could have gotten them. Certainly, I could have made sure they lost their tenure
So,
because I had the witnesses, I had everything, and I said, you know, the peace department, the person's backed off, maybe just leave it alone, and that was probably a mistake.
well,
But
I think that they're all hoping that eventually sanity will prevail. And what concerns me, and that's
you're
actually,
being way over optimistic. That's I don't think that's.
well, like
I
it
think what's
seems to
going on
me,
is incredibly insane,
right,
and
that it seems to me, and this would be kind of a good place for us to finish, would be, it seems to me like there has to be a critical mass, like a Hindenburg incident to lead us to what, to realize, okay, wait a minute, this has gone too far. What I'm concerned about is that when you're talking about, like, if we just let this get so out of control that something horrific happens, which is unfortunately frequently what has to happen in order for people to be shaken out of their stupor, so to speak. When you do that in something like sociology and then in psychology, where we need to just let it go so far out of control that it finally falls flat on its face, I just hope to God that it's not another major genocide event or, another Third Reich style thing that rises out of this to finally shake people enough to get them to realize, okay, maybe allowing people to say that science goes along with what their feelings say, even if none of the data actually supports that, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. It's like a plane crash, for example, is often what it takes for an engineering mistake to be seen. And in this instance, we're talking about a sociology mistake, and then possibly psychology mistakes, and what kind of damage is going to have to be done before we rise back out of this dark ages. Like, does Rome have to burn? And I really hope that's not the case. I know Fresco used to say that he didn't like this, but unfortunately, in many cases, major catastrophes or collapses are what is necessary to finally motivate people to get out of their own zones. Because it sounds to me like what you're describing is an unfortunately natural reaction that they're thinking to themselves, well, I really don't agree with what's going on here, but I have a family to take care of. I have bills to pay, and I don't want to put any of that in jeopardy. Hopefully this problem will just fix itself. It'll work itself out. but enough people eventually do that it comes down to that same like horrible, I mean, like, accurate quote, like, they came for this group and I wasn't part of that group, so I didn't say anything. Then they came for this group and I didn't say anything. And then when it finally came from, them coming for me, there was nobody left to speak up. That's what I think is the most chilling thing that could come out of this, is like, what is going to be that Hindenburg disaster for the social sciences? And unfortunately, how many people are going to get hurt?
I think disaster is somewhere down the road. I don't know. I think this is, I don't think the situation as it currently is going to be solved in the near future. Something more damaging has to occur at the university or the finances of the university, or other things have to get people who have the power to make a difference in the administration of the university. That's the senior administrators, to have some courage and maybe more talents to do something. But right now they are not willing to do anything. And they're even more likely to believe what are essentially lies that are told to them. And the other side of the faculty that's becoming smaller and smaller is going to be just unable to do anything. They just want to get away from it all. And I don't see this situation working out. I think psychology is better protected because of this over specialization issue. They've got
Right.
those, and it's oriented to doing experiments and stuff. You could have the same problems we have, but not as much as sociologists do. And
Well, it's definitely much harder to do a sociological experiment. Like you'd have to get hundreds of
yeah,
people
but
together.
what you do have, first of all, it's probably immoral and not would pass a subjects committee. But
So you're pretty much just like limited to observing historical events and then getting your data accordingly. So that's definitely difficult. I mean, I know, for example, the Ash conformity experiment um, proved that the more people you got involved in the experiment, the more powerful the effect was of a group of
yeah,
people believing something that is not true on the individual. I assume you know what I'm talking about with that one, right?
yeah, and so that's what's happening right now. Is that these lies are literally lies are told. I'm
Right.
surprised students agree to that, because they could be charged and terminated for doing lies like that. But they're so emboldened now that they play dirty because they got moral truth on their side, so they could be immoral. And that doesn't even occur. But most of the severe activists I know are some of the most immoral people I know, because they don't have any morality except whatever they believe, and
Well, it's whatever it takes. It's
that
the ends
justifies doing
justify the
any
means.
act in the name of that morality. And that includes lying and cheating and trying to destroy people's lives, just so you can think that you're an important person on campus. Most of these activists are mediocre scholars, very low rates of productivity compared to the rest of the faculty. So they've always felt the outside, for good reason. They weren't doing at a research university what they need to be doing. They're doing it at a sort of minimal level. They got tenure, but they never, their citations are not much, and they just and so this is their revenge. And I don't think I don't think there's any hope. The only hope I have is that there'd be resources to begin to create new kinds of sociology departments where we don't allow activists. You have to be committed to science, and you have to have voting practices and recruitment practices. Let science department recruit hard scientists and forget the ideology part. And if you do that, you'll see how good these departments could be, how much they'll bring tons of grant money into the university. The faculty will be incredibly grateful, because there'll be no place for them to go if you're the first university doing this. If I had $1 billion, I'd say I want to have a hard science department of sociology at several of the UC campuses, and I'm going to fund it.
Right.
And if I had the money, I'd do that because I'd like to show what a department of really good sociologists, all committed to doing scientific sociology, could do in terms of all the kinds of issues that concern anyone about sociology. It could be like a pure science, but I've always argued you've got to have an engineering wing and a pure science. You've got to have people who know how to translate those general principles into programs that can help people. And sociology can have that potential again. I think we just were too lax there for a while. And the result has been we created a monster, and the monster is not going away. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as a proportion of all sociologists. Sociology departments are probably going to get smaller and smaller because students will stop taking the courses at some point. But if you've got a real hard science department in competing against a activist department, I'll guarantee you the hard science department will win the battle of the students.
And that's
And the
why they're going to
students,
try to call it racist. Like they're going after STEM too. Like the STEM fields are too racist, and oh my goodness.
well, that's they could they could tar and feather us as much as they want. Uh, and there's only one other sociologist in my department that has had as much experience with protests and stuff. He's a nice Marxist. He tends to support some aspects of the group, but he realizes what a bunch of crazies they are by their own department, just nuts
Right.
cases. But we don't agree a lot, but we're friends because we're both hard scientists, and we believe in using science for a purpose. And so we get along quite well. And he's also a sailor, which helps a lot because I'm an avid sailor.
Right.
But yeah, well, that's just my main passion in life. It's about all left I can do. The athletic part of me is long gone. My body fell
Right.
apart. But I can still sail a sailboat. But so not as big a one as I once did. But at
So
least I can
imagine you
do
go
that.
out there with your friend and you have philosophical discussions on the state of
Oh
sociology and
yeah.
science out on your boat. I used to
Yeah.
do that with
Oh
a
yeah.
canoe. I would take friends out on my canoe and we
No,
would just
no.
have
You have
philosophical
a
discussions.
sailboat and a can of beer between your legs, and you're just sailing along with the wind, and just yakking. It's just one of the most pleasurable things in the world to do, and I keep these two boats up in Santa Barbara, which is my favorite place to be in the world, and uh, it's great. But the problem with sociology is I'm in despair in many ways. And the only way I compensate for it is just to go do my hard science work and write it up, get as much of it as published as I can before I die, and hope that it'll last in cyberspace for someone 100 years from now to find and think that, oh, there was this field. I always thought that was a crappy little field of nobodies, but there's people were doing something, and that's what we need. And that's my goal in life. These are what not on my deathbed, but this is all I want to do right now is get as much knowledge out of it as I can, and that's why I'm just creating the blog. Maybe I can become quite aggressive on that in terms of what I say, and people will listen to it and maybe abide by it a little bit. But who knows? But I
Well,
don't think the sociology now, as this practice, is dead. It'll still be alive, but in 30 years, it will not be much. Because I don't see anything happen. I just see more of the same for the next 2 or 3 decades, unless something magical happens in the world that change things. So it's very sad.
this has been an awesome conversation. I really want to thank you for taking this time, on your weekend afternoon, to discuss this with me. And it's unfortunate that it's so bleak, but at least, we recognize that there's a problem, and that's the first step.
Well, I
We,
think
yeah,
I think
go
yeah,
ahead.
I just I've I'm gonna fight with my boots on here and do the best I can as one person in a big world. But the internet is going to be my tool. And even though I'm crappy at it, I got 9 grandchildren who are all good at it. So all young adults can help
Well,
me.
I'll make sure that's the other thing is like, stay in touch because, I'll
Yeah.
spread awareness of that and help share your work. And I want to try to get you on some of these shows that have much bigger audiences than mine. Like Benjamin Boyce would probably love to talk to you too. So I'll start making an effort to go down that route, and maybe I'll talk to Paul Rossi. He was somebody who is an educator who sounded the alarm of like what was going on in his schools, and he's a math teacher, and he was watching how activism is finding its way into math. Like you can't even have mathematical conversations anymore. And so, but anyway, thank you very much for coming on. I will probably talk to you briefly off the air after we are done here. I just wanted to go ahead and conclude this episode. Was there any final words you wanted to give?
No, I've enjoyed watching all these little things flash up of people, we're talking. I mean,
No,
it's
for
actually,
sure.
there's actually some people listening to this. That's nice. Half the time, no one's
Well,
ever
I've been
listened.
kind of prepping them in general.
So,
I've been mentioning that you and I were going to have this conversation for a while, but I do a whole series on my channel called Do You Think for Yourself? And a large
yeah.
part of it is discussing things like Ash conformity experiment, the Milgram experiment, the bystander effect. And those are all like hard scientific psychology and sociology studies that can be replicated. That's what it looks like when it's real science.
It'd be
And
hard to replicate a lot of those now. You couldn't,
yeah,
we wouldn't get
you
through
would
a
definitely
subjects
get in
committee.
trouble. But
Yeah,
the
yeah.
big point is that it's important that to me, and also to Jacques Fresco when he was talking about, because he wanted to create a society where things were more or less kind of governed by scientific principles. And because it was a left leaning or movement that followed what he was doing, a lot of this same kind of activism showed up, and it was a problem because if we're going to try to say that we're going to socially engineer a better society, we can't do that if we don't have real science. If we allow our emotions to become more important than the facts, then you can't do that. At that point, it's like it's like you're blind and you're trying to construct I don't know, a tower or something you can't see. If you made yourself incapable of being able to perceive whether or not you're doing something right or wrong, and it all comes down to your emotional whims, we're going to have a very dangerous society for a time, and that's
Well,
unfortunate.
right. If people who know about social organization have simply basically shot themselves in the foot and the head and the heart, and are unable to give you any knowledge, we have to find another way to get that knowledge. And
Sounds like we're going to have to disguise it.
well, I've been writing. I've written several articles on social engineering. I use the term deliberately to irritate people, just to get them to read it. Um, But that's what sociology needs, an engineering, just a wing, where we take our scientific knowledge and translate it into protocols that can deal with actual problems that are there in the world. Those problems are solvable, maybe not to the degree that everyone would like in a perfect world, but they can be mitigated to significant degrees. But you have to have people working on them who actually have some theoretical understanding of the operative dynamics of this world. And a lot of
Right.
people don't. They just have a bunch of political views. They haven't spent time reading and reading and reading, like I do, history and a lot of other things, just to get a sense for how things have, how the world is played out, and see what the underlying forces operate that are causing the world to play out that way, develop propositions and models. All those can be used again now to rebuild society. So that's the beauties. We're not locked into our genes the way most other mammals are. We can create something. Right now, we're creating a nightmare of political correctness. And sooner we get rid of that and get back on the track of sciences, the more useful social science will be for society. But I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon. I'm depressed about it. But I just can't. Yeah, well, I can't. I just have to remain depressed about it because I can't change it. I'm going to try my
Well, I
best.
hope that someday, down the road, somebody will stumble on this conversation in your
Oh, I hope
papers
so.
and,
That's right. And here was this
you
old
know,
man holding his finger in the dike, and he finally croaked out. The finger went out, and it all went to hell. But I'm buried, and it'd be nice. Even
Well,
theorists
thanks
have their fat.
again so much, Dr. Turner, for coming on today. And I will make sure to keep people aware of your work, and I'll continue to follow what you're doing. Make sure that if you finally launch your blog, that you email it to me, and I'll be sure to share that with everybody here. I will
Okay.
provide a link to
And
the
John
papers we're
Jackson
working
went to
on.
UCSB. So did I. Graduated
Oh,
UCSB in 65.
right. Yep. He's one of my regulars here. And they all enjoyed this. So,
Okay.
but thanks again. And again, I'm gonna take us off live for a second and just have a few moments with you after, off the air to
Okay.
decompress. But
Okay.
thanks again, everybody, for tuning in to V Radio. You guys can check out my website, hy.page/V Radio, where you can find me on my other mediums. I strongly advise that you check me out on all of them, whether it's Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute. I also have podcast forms of all of this that you can listen to on Spotify and other podcast mediums. And I do all of this for redundancy because one of the other problems I run into is that conversations like these are not very popular with certain people. And as we found out with the recent Twitter nonsense, those people have a tendency to put their finger on the scale to be sure that certain ideas get more exposure than others. If you really want to help me, the best way to do it is to make sure that you share these conversations and share knowledge of that my channel even exists so that I can get out and get this information to the people who need it. I do appreciate it when people financially support the show. Obviously, it's not required. I'm never going to charge anyone for V Radio. But if you would like to do that at hy.page/V Radio, you can also support me on Patreon, PayPal, Subscribestar, etc. If there's another way you'd rather send money, you can reach out to me on Discord. Speaking of that, you can join us on our social media accounts, which is really the only way to be sure you're going to get this, because I already get notifications from people that they've been unsubscribed to my channel, involuntarily, or that they're not getting notifications when I go live. So if you go to my Discord channel, even if you have no intention of taking part in the conversation, I always do a slash at everyone to make people aware when I'm going live or when I put out new content. The conversations there are also very good. People of different ideological backgrounds engaging in conversation with one rule, which is no personal attack. And the kind of thing, things that come out of that on the other side are usually very awesome to see. I will be planning more content. I'm sorry that I was gone as long as I was, but I had to move very suddenly, and then I got sick on top of it. In fact, I'm still sick. That's why I burst into this horrible coughing spree when we got started, because I was leaning back on my bed because I have to broadcast from my bed because of my spinal damage. And it just happened to be at the perfect angle for phlegm to decide, yeah, you're not breathing right now. So I hope you guys enjoyed this today. And thanks again, Dr. Turner. I'll talk to you again briefly here for a second. Did you want to say something else before we go?
No, thank you for listening. It's been pleasant. I had nothing but page proofs to read, so this was much more fun than that. So now I have to go to those. And,
well, hopefully we'll talk
I used to be
again
able to watch
sometime.
football and things like that, but I'm always too busy now. So
All right.
just go back
Thanks
to work.
again, everybody, for tuning in today. And again, I will also link the article that I was showing at the earlier part of this in the description of this video. If for some reason I forget, please feel free to remind me in the comments. Thanks